Thank you for the handrail, by the way. Seems to me as though a few years ago, maybe when I was here, I might have bounded up those stairs. Bounding is a thing of the past. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate very much the invitation to come and talk to you for a few minutes this morning, and hope that I can share with you the fruits of some study that I've done that can help us to think about, as we just sang, exalting the incredible Messiah, the Christ, who did so much for us. I had an opportunity in 2023, the church, the group of brethren, one of the groups that meets in Dixon, Tennessee, the Oak Avenue congregation, in the summertime, they have a series. They've been doing this for a long time. They'll pick a subject, and then they'll have a quarter in the summer where for 13 straight Wednesday nights, they'll have somebody come in and have different aspects of that topic that they will talk about. I've been going and participating in that for a long time. They started in 2020. I started in 2000 doing it, and I was there that first year, and I've been there every summer since then with just a couple of exceptions. And in 2023, the theme that they decided to talk about, to use as part of what they were studying, were different titles that are used of the Messiah in the New Testament. And there are a number of them, and you can see some of them here listed on the screen. One of the advantages of having participated in that study for so long is that I'm one of the older now men who have been involved in that study. I've been there from the first. And so for the last several years, I get my pick of what I want to talk about. And so they gave me this list. There were actually a little bit more, a few more names on the list than just this. But they gave me the list of the things they wanted me to talk about, and one stood out in particular, and I selected it immediately. And it wasn't any of these, by the way. It's what I want to talk with you for a few minutes about this morning. It is the expression Son of Man. And there were two reasons why that caught my eye and why I chose that and wanted to talk about that in particular. One of them was that it occurred to me that in almost 50 years of preaching, I didn't remember ever having done a lesson on that designation or that title, Son of Man. But the real reason that I wanted to do it was for my own personal study. Son of Man is an extremely important designation in the New Testament. And I hope I can show you why I think that's so for a few minutes in the lesson this morning. So I want to start with the idea of Son of Man in the Old Testament. And we'll be jumping around to a number of different passages, looking at a number of different things. But the expression Son of Man appears a number of times in the Old Testament. I mean, I really did, in getting ready for that lesson last summer, I really did a deep dive into the subject and looking up the expression and seeing how it was used. And that expression appears 107 times in the Old Testament, but interestingly, most of the time, the vast majority of time, it appears in the book of Ezekiel, which is one of the, among our brethren, I think at least, one of the least studied books in the Old Testament. Daniel would be up there, I think, although we like the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel because we have those great stories about the statue, the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel being put into the lion's den. From chapter 7 on, it gets a lot more complicated. But the book of Ezekiel, the book of Zechariah, books in the Old Testament that are very apocryphal, contain a lot of prophecy, a lot of vision, a lot of things about the Messiah, are books we kind of shy away from. And Ezekiel is one of those books. I love the book of Ezekiel, by the way. Love to study the book, love to teach the book. And that expression appears, again, 93 times, almost always with reference to Ezekiel himself. And I should mention that in the book of Ezekiel, it is always God who calls Ezekiel Son of Man. That's God's chosen designation for Ezekiel in that book. Daniel is called Son of Man one time in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 17. It's interesting, though, it's not God who calls Daniel Son of Man. It is the angel Gabriel who refers to him as Son of Man. Daniel's trying to understand this vision that he's seeing, and God sends Gabriel to Daniel to explain to him, tell him what it is that he's seeing and what it means. And Gabriel then calls Daniel Son of Man. So that's in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 17. There are a few times in the Old Testament where the expression is used by one person describing another person. Not especially interested in those, but they do appear. There are a few of those in the Old Testament. And then there's one other passage in the Old Testament. I just want to mention it right now and suggest that we'll come back to it. So you might want to have Daniel chapter 7 kind of marked. We'll come back and talk about this in just a few minutes. But in Daniel chapter 8, Gabriel called Daniel son of man. But in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel in a vision refers to the Son of Man. He talks about seeing one like a Son of Man. And Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 is clearly a messianic prophecy. Daniel is seeing something about the Messiah in the New Testament. So that's the expression Son of Man. That's where it comes from in the Old Testament. And usually if I'm teaching the book of Ezekiel, I do spend a little bit of time talking about the significance of that expression. What about the use of the expression Son of Man in the New Testament? In the New Testament, and this is interesting, I think, in the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man 77 times in the gospel accounts. As a matter of fact, when Jesus is talking about himself, he almost always refers to himself as Son of Man. He very seldom refers to himself as anything other than Son of Man. Matthew records that 30 times. It's found 12 times Jesus calling himself Son of Man in Mark, 24 times in Luke, and 11 times in John. So you have 83 total times in those gospel accounts where the Son of Man is used to designate Jesus. Jesus calling himself Son of Man, or somebody else referring to Jesus as Son of Man. And so, especially when you think about the fact that when Jesus is referring to himself, he chose most often to call himself Son of Man. There has to be some special significance to that, and I think clearly there is. There are a few other times in the New Testament when that expression Son of Man appears, and it's talking about Jesus all three times. In Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is being stoned, and keep this passage in mind as well. Acts chapter 7, we'll come back to the idea of this a little bit later in the lesson. But in Acts chapter 7, as Stephen is being stoned, he says, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." And so Stephen sees Jesus. He sees and he calls him the Son of Man, standing at the right hand of the Son of God. In Hebrews chapter 2, and we have a quotation from the 144th Psalm where God the Father refers to the Son as Son of Man. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. That's Hebrews chapter 2 and in verse 6. And then two times in the book of Revelation, the expression Son of Man is used. It's referring to the Messiah. It's referring to Jesus both times. In the very beginning of Revelation, the very beginning of John explaining the vision, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And one of the things he says very early on is in verse 13, in the midst of the lampstand, somebody had been talking to him, he said. And I looked around, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. It is the Son of Man who was speaking to him. It is the Messiah. It is Jesus who was speaking to him. And then a little bit later on in Revelation chapter 14, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand." He's going to use this sickle to reap the harvest of those who were ungodly. So you have those expressions, Son of Man. And when you think about those uses of the Son of Man, especially in the New Testament, why is it that would be the expression that Jesus would use most often to refer to himself? I ran across a commentary someplace that suggested that, well, Son of Man is, and by the way, I think it is right that Son of Man is a way of just, maybe we wouldn't say Son of Man, we might say human being. It is that kind of a designation. But the point that the commentator was making was this would have been just a common way that the Greeks and the Romans would have spoken in the first century, but it doesn't offer any proof for that. And I haven't found any evidence of that, and we don't commonly speak that way today. If I were to, if you were not acquainted with Bill and I was going to introduce you to Bill, I wouldn't say, I want to introduce you to my friend, Bill Couchman, human being. I wouldn't describe him. You would assume that he was a human being. And so human being, I think, is part of what Son of Man means. It's the idea, or at least part of the idea of the meaning of Son of Man. But I don't think it would have been common. In other words, Jesus isn't just using common language when over and over and over again he refers to himself as the Son of Man. So the question then is, and that's what I want to try to answer in a few minutes that we have together this morning. The question is, why did Jesus so often refer to himself as the Son of Man? I'm going to suggest four answers to that question. And I want to tell you right at the very beginning, and I'll try to remember to say this again as we go on. The first three I'm guessing about, or we're guessing about. Why would Jesus refer to himself as Son of Man so often? Why does he call himself Son? As a matter of fact, he calls himself Son of Man more often. You take all the other designations that he might have used and combine all of those, Son of Man is used more than all of those together. Why would he do that? So the first three I'm guessing about. I think that, and I'll give you some scriptural support for some of these. I think there are reasons to think that these might be why he's doing it. But the point is that we don't know why he called himself Son of Man. Jesus doesn't ever say. The reason I'm using that expression is this. And the gospel writers don't ever stop to say, you may have noticed that over and over again when I'm quoting Jesus, he refers to himself as Son of Man. This is why he said it. There's nothing like that in the New Testament. So we have to make some educated guesses. And one of them would be that it may be that what he's doing is he's trying to highlight his humanity, that he was God. Jesus was fully human. And that would have been important in the first century. By the end of the first century, and it's not really till the middle of the second century that what is called Gnosticism becomes full-blown. But by the time you get to the end of the first century, there are hints, especially in the writings of John, that Gnosticism was already in the process of growing. And one of the major tenets of Gnosticism was Jesus was not a human being. He was not a person. He was not a man. And so it may be that one of the things he's doing is he's telling us, he's emphasizing, he's stressing over and over and over again that he is fully human. Jesus was fully human, by the way, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We could do a whole lesson on each one of these 4 points, and I'm just going to make some highlight comments. But you think about all of the things in the New Testament that emphasize and stress his humanity. He got hungry. He got thirsty. He got tired like we do. He knew human emotion. John chapter 11, he wept at the death of Lazarus. The interesting thing about that is that he cried knowing that Lazarus died, and he knew exactly what he was about to do. He knew he was about to bring him back to life, but he'd seen the sisters crying, and Lazarus had been in the tomb for several days, and the text says that Jesus wept. He knew a limitation on human knowledge. He had a limitation of human knowledge. In Matthew chapter 24, at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, we're right at the end of the life of Jesus. And they're on the Mount of Olives. Jesus and the apostles are on the Mount of Olives. They can look to the west, and they can see the beautiful temple up there. And the apostles comment about it. They comment about those beautiful buildings that are standing up there. And Jesus shocks them. Remember, he tells them, the time is coming when those buildings aren't going to be standing there anymore. And they ask him 2 questions. I think they're only asking him 1 question. I think they're asking him 2. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? Now, again, that's 2 questions. I think what they're saying is, if you're talking about this city being destroyed, that must be when you come back to bring the world to an end. And so in their minds, it's just 1 question, but he breaks it up into 2 questions. When will these things be? When are these buildings going to be torn down? And he tells them in the first 35 verses. Here's how you can know when that's about to happen. As a matter of fact, he gives them signs. He gives them warnings. When you see the abomination of desolation set up in the holy place. And by the way, if we were, this would be a better lesson probably in a Bible class, because the question I would ask you is, where does Jesus get the idea of the abomination of desolation? Where does that come from? And you would know, right? You would know that, well, that Daniel said that. He's talking about something that Daniel said, that Daniel talked about. And that'd be exactly right. You'll see when you see it set up, flee. When that happens, and pray that it's not in the winter when it would be harder to travel. Pray that it's not on the Sabbath when the gates of Jerusalem would be locked. You need to be able to get it. Don't go home and pack. When you see that happen, get out of town. He's talking about in 70 A.D. when the Romans laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. Actually in 68, when they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, they broke the siege off for a while. There are interesting reasons why they did that. But then they set the siege back up again, and eventually in 70 A.D. the Romans enter the city, they destroy it, they level it, and the Christians were gone. The Christians had followed the signs. That's the first question. When will these things be? Well, it's coming. And it's coming relatively quickly, and you don't want to be there when it happens. But what about his coming? What about my coming? He says in verse 36, I can't tell you the answer to that. This is the Gary Kerr translation, by the way. I can't tell you when that's coming because, you think about this, he's the Messiah. He's God. But he says, I don't know when he's coming, when I'm coming back. Only the Father in heaven knows. He had a limitation of human knowledge. There are some things that the Father knew that he had not yet shared with the Son. Jesus was a human being. He was totally human. He was completely human. And Son of Man emphasizes that Jesus was God in the flesh. He was totally human. But, and this is the second point, well, he was God who had come in the flesh, which leads us to the second point. Maybe he used that designation to emphasize and stress the fact that he was God, that he was deity. Very clearly, when you read the gospel accounts, Jesus was not just a man. Jesus was the man. Jesus was exactly what God intended for humanity to be when he created human beings. So John will say about him in John chapter 1 and verse 14, full of grace and truth. And Paul will say about him in Colossians chapter 2, for in him, in Jesus, who was a human being, in him all the fullness of deity dwells bodily. And so Jesus was God. He was the Son of Man. He was not just a human being. He was the human being. He was God in the flesh. And so we go to that passage, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail here in just a few minutes too. But we go to that passage that's part of the different trials that Jesus experienced on the night before he was crucified, the morning that he was crucified. He's standing before Caiaphas, and he makes this claim. I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man. In his trial, he calls himself Son of Man. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus was deity. Jesus was God. Now, let me just say this very quickly. This is really just kind of a sidebar. But the question comes up from time to time, and those of us who are old enough to have been around in the decade of the 1980s remember that this became a rather heated topic among brethren in the 1980s. That there were brethren who said, Jesus, when he came to earth, he was totally human, but what they said that meant was he stopped being God. He gave up deity in order to become a human being. In response to that, it almost always happens like this, doesn't it, brethren? That when one extreme position appears, the response to it becomes the other extreme. And the other extreme was he was never human while he was on the earth. He was just God. And so I heard a gospel preacher in a lesson arguing that Jesus was just God, that he was not a person. And he said, I know the question is going to come up, well, what was that body? And this was his response in the pulpit. That body wasn't anything more than just a costume. And the way he illustrated that was when the little boy comes and knocks on your door on October the 31st, and he's got a Batman mask on, and he's got a Batman costume on, and he's got a Batman cape on, you don't open the door and say, wow, Batman's here. You understand and recognize it's just a costume. And that's what Jesus was. He wasn't a human being when he was on the earth. How could he be both God and man at the same time? If math people, you're going to have to trust me on this, I guess. I believe Jesus was 100% human being while he was here. But I also believe the Bible teaches that he was 100% God while he was here. He did things in the flesh that only God can do. And again, Bible class question, what is the prime example of that? What is the one thing that only God can do that Jesus did? He forgave sins. He forgave sins. And they understood that he's putting himself on a level with God when he said that. So how can you have 100% God, 100% man in the same person, in the same being? And here's my response to that. After listening to all of that arguing and fussing and writing and debating back in the 1980s, here's my response to that. How could Jesus be both 100% God and 100% man at the same time? I don't know. But I believe that he was, because I believe that's what the Bible teaches. And I accept that. I accept that he could be totally human when he needed to be human. He could be hungry. He could be sad. When he needed to be God, he could be that. He could say not, and he does say this on the cross, he doesn't say to the people who are crucifying him, but have you noticed this? Have you ever thought about this? He doesn't say to them, I forgive you. He says to them, Father, forgive them. But you think about all of the other times in the gospel accounts when Jesus says to someone, your sins are forgiven. As a matter of fact, on the cross, he says that to one of the thieves. He forgives that one's sins and says, today you will be with me in paradise. So maybe when Jesus is claiming to be Son of Man, maybe when he uses that designation, he's emphasizing his deity. Maybe a combination of both of those two things. Maybe he's saying, I am God and man at the same time. I looked at, when I was getting ready for this lesson last summer, I was looking to see what some other brethren maybe had said about it, sermons that might have been preached, articles that might have been written. The most common explanation for why Jesus is called Son of Man so often is that it demonstrates his humility. That makes a lot of sense to me. There is something humbling about referring to yourself when you are God, and when you know you are God, there's something humbling about calling yourself just human being, just Son of Man. He could have called himself Messiah. He could have called himself Christ. He could have called himself Son of God, but over and over and over again, he refers to himself as Son of Man. And so when he took on flesh, he intentionally lowered his status. The author of the book of Hebrews will say in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 that there's an advantage in that to us. Because he humbled himself, because he took on the form of a human being, he can sympathize with our weaknesses as one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And so he can sympathize with us. And I love the passage in Philippians chapter 2. Such an incredibly powerful passage about the humility of Jesus. And Paul using the humility of Jesus to illustrate why we need to be humble. Have this mind among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so he demonstrates his humility. Did Jesus adopt the title Son of Man to prove that he was a human being? Maybe, but I'm not sure about that. Possibly. Did he adopt the title Son of Man to argue that he was God in the flesh? Perhaps so. Maybe that's part of it. I'm not confident about that, though. I'm not really sure about that. I think that's possible. I think that's likely. I'm a little bit more comfortable in making this point, though, that it absolutely demonstrates his humility. He's showing us humility. He's demonstrating humility for us. He's illustrating for us the kind of humility that he expects from us. That he could have claimed the title of God. He could have claimed the title of Christ, the title of Messiah, but he intentionally does not do that. So that's the first 3 points. And again, Jesus never says anywhere why he called himself Son of Man. None of the gospel writers or none of the apostles or inspired prophets who write the rest of the New Testament, none of them ever say this is why he called himself Son of Man. But I think there is a point that we can make with a lot more confidence. And that is this, that he referred to himself most often as Son of Man because he was demonstrating, he was proving that he was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. So go back with me to Matthew chapter 26 just for a moment. Remember, again, on the night before he's crucified, excuse me, on the night before he's crucified, he has a trial before Pilate. Pilate sends him to Herod. He ends up at Caiaphas' house with a trial before the high priest, or at least one of the high priests. And in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 64, I want you to look at the claim that Jesus makes here. Jesus says, "But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And I want you to notice, I'm not going to read the rest of Matthew chapter 26, but what happened when he said that? All night they have been trying to find some way to bring a capital charge against him. In other words, we need him dead. We need him put to death. And they've been trying all night, and nothing has stuck. Nothing works. Now all of a sudden he says this, "I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest exploded. The council went nuts. And all of a sudden now we have him. We've got him now. Now we can charge him with death. Now we can enact the death penalty. What is there in that sentence that caused them to react like that? Why is it that the high priest gets so upset? Why is it that the council says, yes, now we can kill him? It is this. Keep your place there in Matthew chapter 26. And if you've kept the mark, go back to Daniel chapter 7. Go back. I'll put the ESV translation of verse 13 up on the screen. What is Jesus doing in Matthew 26? He's quoting Daniel's prophecy. So here's what Daniel says in verse 13. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him." That's the Messiah. Daniel said, "I saw that." The amazing thing about that is Daniel said that 500 years before it happened. Daniel's seeing what's going to happen. The Son of Man, all of a sudden, we're with God. God is on his throne. God the Father is on his throne. And all these multitudes are surrounding God. And all of a sudden, up through the clouds comes one like the Son of Man. And he is presented to God. He is presented before the fathers. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So here's what Daniel's seeing. Daniel's seeing from the other side what the apostles saw from down here. So look at Acts chapter 1 and verse 9. Jesus has been with the apostles for a while. Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 15 that during this period of time after his resurrection, he had shown himself alive to more than 500 people. And now he's going. He's leaving. And Luke describes that. And this is what he says about it. When he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. Now, what had Daniel just said? "I saw coming through the clouds one like the Son of Man. What happened when the body of Jesus, and it was his earthly body that he took with him, what happened when the body of Jesus disappeared through the clouds? It came out, can we say on the other side without anybody taking that too literally? It came out on the other side in the presence of the Father. In other words, where have we seen clouds before? Matthew chapter 26. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. As a matter of fact, we've seen clouds other places already, haven't we? What did Stephen say? The clouds parted. I looked, and there was the Son of Man standing next to the Ancient of Days, standing next to the Father. Isn't that amazing? The apostles see him disappearing through the clouds. 500 years before, Daniel saw him coming up through those clouds. That's what he references in Matthew chapter 24. And somebody might say, well, you know, that's still not enough. Is that enough to have made the high priest, to have made Cahaba so angry? I think maybe not. Maybe not. I don't think it was just that he saw him coming through the clouds. I think it's the rest of the prophecy. What did that mean when the Messiah comes through the clouds, goes to the Ancient of Days, is presented to God the Father? Verse 14, the Son of Man would be given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. What is it that got Jesus sentenced to death? The apostles, the enemies of Jesus, the high priest, the council, they understand. He's saying that he's about to be made the king. He's going to be handed dominion and glory and a kingdom, everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, a kingdom that shall not be destroyed. They've been trying all night to find something to pin on him that would justify them killing him. Now they've got it. He says he is that person, that fulfillment of that prophecy. He's the one who's going to receive all dominion, all power, who's going to receive the kingdom. And so they charge him with blasphemy. And within a few hours, they are able to successfully put him to death. What is it that got Jesus killed? It was the claim to be the Son of Man. Why is Jesus over and over again in the New Testament refer to himself as the Son of Man? I think we can say with some certainty. I think maybe he was showing that he was human. Maybe he was showing that he was divine. Maybe a combination of those. I'm a little more confident that he was showing some humility in calling himself Son of Man. But I think he's setting things up from the very beginning so that he can say what he says before the council, before the high priest. I am the fulfillment of that prophecy in the Old Testament. I'm the one Daniel saw coming through the clouds. I'm the one who the Father is going to give a kingdom. I'm the one who's going to be the king. That's the Messiah that we serve. We serve the Son of Man. We serve one who is totally human, and I'm absolutely convinced that he was completely and totally human. We serve one who was totally God. He gave up the prerogatives of deity by coming and taking on the form of a man. He left heaven. He was no longer in the presence of the Father. But he didn't give up deity. He didn't stop being God. He was God in the flesh. He was humble. And he was so humble that it gave us an example of the kind of humility that God and that he expects from us. But most importantly, I think, he claims to be the Son of God because he is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. As a matter of fact, what is one of the very last things that he will say to the apostles before they see him disappearing up into the clouds? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. The council understands that. He's claiming to be the Messiah. He's claiming to be the Son of God. And I love what Mark says about this, and I'll close with this. I love what Mark says about this in Mark chapter 10. Mark is quoting Jesus, and Jesus will use the designation Son of Man again. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What we have in Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man is we have the gospel. We have the plan of salvation in capsule form. Jesus came. He was God in the flesh. He lived a perfect life. But he was also the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. He's victorious. That defeat or that disappearance into the cloud was not Jesus fleeing from the earth. It was Jesus ascending to glory at the right hand of God, where God the Father honored him and bestowed upon him, with only one exception. There's another good Bible class question. All authority in heaven and on earth. The Son of Man. Because Jesus was the Son of Man, you and I can have forgiveness of sins. We can have all spiritual blessings in the heavenly places in this life. We can have, most importantly, I think, the hope of being in heaven with God the Father and with the Son of Man and the Holy Spirit and the angels and godly people, so many, a myriad of godly people who've gone on before us. That's possible because Jesus was the Son of Man. If you're here and you haven't responded to the invitation that the Son of Man offers, you haven't responded by confessing that you believe Jesus is God's Son and repenting of your sins and being baptized. And by the way, if you're not sure about that, if you have questions about that, the brethren here would be thrilled, I know. Any of them would be, to sit down and open their Bibles, open your Bibles with them and talk with them about that. If you know now, though, what you need to do because of what the Son of Man did for you, then this is an opportunity that you have to render obedience to the gospel to become a Christian. If there's something along the lines of prayers that you need, public sins that need to be confessed, if there are other things that also you need to have drawn to the attention of the brethren here, then the invitation is for you as well. If we can help or assist you in any way in coming to the Son of Man, responding to his sacrifice for us, please let us know how we can do that by coming down to one of these front seats, and do that right now while we stand and while we